He used to sit high and mighty in one of the most luxurious mansions in Hollywood, wrapped completely in the dazzling glow of primetime television fame, and especially under the absolute, impenetrable protection of a multi-billion-dollar religious empire. For nearly 2 long decades, Danny Masterson remained utterly confident that he was completely untouchable. He viewed himself as a chosen golden boy, a man entitled to operate and live within a lawless paradise, where the women around him were merely toys, mere prey in his predatory pursuit. But there's a brutal truth that self-proclaimed gods often forget. Artificial deities always run out of power to maintain their halo. At 47 years old, that supposedly eternal shield of ultimate protection shattered into tiny pieces right before his eyes, dragging him into a cushionless free-fall straight to the absolute rock bottom of society. Welcome back to our in-depth dossier on the darkest corners of the elite world, before the cold iron gates of prison officially slammed shut behind him, and before the elite circles, the glittering stars of Los Angeles, chose to quickly turn their backs, pretending to forget the name Danny Masterson to protect themselves. We must ask the core question: how could a sitcom star possess a lifetime passport to commit the most horrific crimes while remaining completely unbothered by the law? Imagine a bizarre world where your spiritual leaders, the heads of your religion, never offer a word of guidance or sincere repentance, but instead immediately deploy an underground network of the most ruthless attorneys to silence and threaten your victims. Imagine waking up one morning in a chemically induced haze, realizing your body has been brutally violated, only to have your own church step in and threaten you with eternal damnation if you dare think about calling the police. Danny Masterson did not just play a rebellious, cool teenager on the small screen. In real life, he directed and operated a highly sophisticated and inhumane system of trading souls. From the ultra-luxurious VIP rooms of elite Hollywood nightclubs to the sickening moral bankruptcy of a religious organization that weaponized psychological trauma across generations. This is a forensic legal and psychological breakdown of a systematic cover-up campaign of unprecedented scale. Stay with us as we peel back the layers of this mystery, exposing the shocking downfall of Danny Masterson, a chilling tale of absolute privilege, spiritual manipulation, and a golden crown that rotted completely from the inside out. To truly understand how Danny Masterson managed to evade justice, defying law enforcement for over 20 years, our first mandatory step is to completely strip away the glamorous mask of the character Stephen Hyde. On the small screens of millions of families, Hyde was a symbol of freedom, a rebellious youth constantly fighting against the injustices of the social system. Yet, the moment the studio lights faded, in real life, Danny Masterson was a ruthless parasite. He fully and intelligently exploited that very broken and loose system to satisfy his darkest impulses and sick desires. Tracing back to the early 2000s, the hit television series That 70s Show was not just an entertainment program. It was a literal cash cow for the network and its cast members. Danny Masterson at that time possessed all the brightest aura of an A-list star, wealth flowing into his bank accounts like water, accompanied by a solid, seemingly unshakable position in the cinematic capital of Hollywood. However, you must understand that his star status was only half of his shield. The other half, far more fortified, terrifying, and possessing absolute shadow power, lay in a name that everyone feared: Scientology. Within the internal power structure of this organization, Masterson's family members were no ordinary people. They belonged to the high-ranking aristocracy. They were not merely churchgoers making small donations. They were major donors contributing millions of dollars, serving as the perfect faces of success and wealth used by the church as an aggressive recruitment tool. To the leadership of Scientology, Danny Masterson was viewed as a real-life Sith Lord, a high-influence warrior tasked with a top-secret mission to expand and consolidate the church's influence right at the heart of the entertainment world. And of course, in a world running on transactional deals, the reward for absolute loyalty and Danny's massive financial contributions was the ultimate privilege that any criminal would envy: total moral and legal immunity granted by the church. Thanks to the solid shield, Danny Masterson's predatory formula was established with extreme consistency, sophistication, and systematic execution over many years. The familiar location was always a secluded mansion nestled deep in the Hollywood Hills, a perfect spot to isolate victims from the outside world. The effective tools were cocktail glasses cleverly laced with high-potency stimulants or sedatives, leaving the victims unable to resist while keeping their memories foggy. And his targets were very carefully selected. Young, beautiful women, most of whom were also members of Scientology. These girls, from a very young age, had been strictly conditioned and brainwashed to absolutely obey the organization, believing that betraying or damaging the reputation of a high-ranking member like Danny was an unforgivable sin. When the victims woke up after a night of nightmares, in a state of physical pain, completely disoriented in space, and realizing they'd been brutally assaulted, what awaited them at that mansion was not an apology or remorse from the perpetrator. What met them at the front door was a brutal psychological silencing apparatus, a professional system designed solely to make them doubt their own memories and force them into fearful silence. Whenever a brave victim of Danny Masterson intended or even entertained the idea of stepping into the light to expose his wrongdoings, the church's sophisticated security apparatus would immediately activate its highest level of defense. We must look deep into how this million-dollar shield operated to see just how terrifying it truly was. It was never just about throwing cash to settle a case or buying off parties. Its true nature was a systematic campaign of psychological terror, an organized character assassination meant to destroy the very roots of a human life. According to the strict internal regulations and laws of the church, if a member dare report the crimes of another member, especially an influential star and a diamond donor like Danny, the public authorities, specifically the police, whom they always mockingly refer to as lower entities, it would be deemed a supreme, unforgivable transgression. Any victim attempting to seek justice from national laws would immediately be labeled a suppressive person, an oppressor actively sabotaging the organization. How terrifying were the consequences of being slapped with that label? The answer is that you would be forced into a state of total, immediate disconnection. All your parents, siblings, relatives, and lifelong friends, if they remain inside the church, will be forced to disown you completely, treating and viewing you as a dead person, a ghost that did not exist. For young girls who were born, raised, and had their entire lives embedded in this religious community, this meant a cruel sentence of exile from the only world they had ever known. They would lose their entire social support network, family, and emotional ties in a single night, becoming stranded and isolated in life. But the cruelty of this cover-up machine never stopped at isolation. The fair game policy enforced by the church permitted its security members to use the dirtiest, most extreme tactics to defame and utterly ruin the life of anyone who dared to betray them. Victims, after filing their reports, would be placed under 24/7 surveillance by professional private investigators hired by the church. Their household pets would suddenly die a mysterious poisoning without a trace of the cause. Their personal phones were tapped, their bank accounts constantly suffered hacking attempts, and their lives were turned into a living hell as they repeatedly faced baseless lawsuits from top-tier law firms for one single objective: to drain them completely of financial resources and break their spirits until they voluntarily withdrew their accusations. Reflecting back to 2004, when 3 brave women decided to overcome all fear to step into the Los Angeles Police Department to report the incidents, they bitterly realized a very harsh reality. The tentacles of Danny Masterson's million-dollar shield had reached deep inside the local law enforcement system itself. Case files related to him, by some miraculous occurrence, were repeatedly misplaced or misfiled in the archives. Lead investigators tracking the case suddenly received notices of reassignment to other departments, or they would directly meet and discreetly advise the victims to voluntarily drop the charges to avoid unnecessary trouble for themselves and their families. During all this time, Danny Masterson still stood casually on the balcony of his lavish mansion, sipping red wine, looking down at the glittering lights of Los Angeles, and smugly believing he had completely won the game. The divine shield had executed its duty flawlessly. He truly believed he was an immortal god, a creature standing at the absolute top of the food chain in Hollywood. Yet, in his ultimate arrogance, Danny Masterson committed a fatal mistake. He forgot the most supreme and ruthless rule of the shadow power game. A protective shield only holds value as long as the object it protects retains its utility and does not pose a threat to the entire system. When that supposedly eternal wall of silence began to crack under the massive pressure of a new era, an era of awakening injustice, that religious empire would not hesitate for a second to crush its own favorite son to save its own skin. When a predator has been nurtured for too long in an environment entirely devoid of any penalties, their psychology automatically shifts from caution to a borderline pathological state of arrogance. Danny Masterson, throughout his peak years on that 70s show and later during the initial stages of The Ranch on Netflix, was no longer a regular actor simply turning up to earn a paycheck. He genuinely viewed himself as a lawmaker, an uncrowned king ruling over a velvet-lined underground kingdom, completely intoxicated by the suffocating fumes of absolute power. He believed that as long as he continued to sign six-figure sponsorship checks to the secret bank accounts of the church, and as long as the cult's private investigators kept systematically terrorizing and silencing victims, the world would forever rotate on the exact axis he desired. This arrogance grew so monstrous that he began leaving behind sloppy trails that an experienced predator would never normally allow. He comfortably laughed about his controlling and manipulative behavior toward women at exclusive closed-door parties, confidently defying the growing whispers circulating behind the scenes of major Hollywood studios. But the elite world, with all its luxury and blinding glamour, is actually a system running on a deeply ruthless and transactional algorithm. Money and shadow power come by the silence of the past, but they possess absolutely no ability to freeze the flow of time or stop the shifting of social structures. As the world transitioned into the mid-2010s, a massive socio-psychological earthquake began silently forming beneath the soil of Los Angeles. It was the exact moment when the protective shields of seemingly eternal giants started cracking under the immense pressure of victim awakening and intense public scrutiny. Danny Masterson, buried in the absolute self-complacency of someone living inside a religious bubble for too long, was completely blind to these early warning signs. He continued to deploy his archaic predatory formula, placing absolute faith in the church's security apparatus to suppress any rebellion. He never expected that the women he had brutally violated and forced into isolated disconnections years ago were no longer frightened. Helpless young girls easily broken by threats of excommunication or religious shunning. They had found one another, quietly connecting and forging an unbreakable alliance built on a raw courage weaponized through years of enduring a living hell. The eruption of the Me Too movement in 2017 was not merely an internet trend. It was a razor-sharp scalpel that completely severed the underground ties protecting elite predators for decades. Suddenly, top-tier law firms and professional PR agencies hired to bury scandals realized a terrifying truth. Continuing to shield a systemic sexual predator at this specific moment meant total brand suicide. The grand million-dollar wall of silence that Scientology had built around Danny Masterson for over 20 years was suddenly forced to confront an suffocating wave of public outrage. A pressure that even massive financial contributions could no longer bribe or pacify. As major media outlets and independent investigative journalists began digging into forgotten, dusty archives of the Los Angeles Police Department regarding Danny Masterson, a sickening reality of bribery and systemic manipulation was exposed to the light. This was no longer a story about an individual star's misconduct. It had evolved into a massive federal-level case, exposing an organized, systematic criminal cover-up campaign backed by a multi-billion-dollar religious empire. Legal pressure was no longer just empty warnings or quiet, confidential civil settlements using cash. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, under suffocating public scrutiny, was forced to officially reactivate the investigation with absolute seriousness. At this exact moment, the most Tandoori, satirical script in the game of power began executing with clinical precision. Imagine a religious organization that once proclaimed Danny Masterson as a Sith Lord, an untouchable warrior, and a chosen golden boy, reacting to the reality of the legal system's investigative tentacles pointing directly at their core headquarters. The answer is delightfully simple. They immediately activated self-preservation mode and prepared for the coldest internal purge imaginable. In the universe of spiritual manipulators, there is zero room for unconditional loyalty. Loyalty only exists when it generates profit and poses no threat to the survival of the machine. Danny Masterson began feeling the freezing chill of betrayal from the very place he once considered his ultimate fortress. His desperate phone calls to high-ranking church officials suddenly went unanswered. Top-tier attorneys who used to arrive within 5 minutes to solve his legal messes were suddenly, inexplicably busy with other corporate litigations. The church began quietly altering its internal rhetoric, desperately seeking to detach the organization's reputation from Danny's personal legal liabilities. The millions of dollars he had contributed over the years were no longer a lifetime immunity passport. They had transformed into an institutional liability, and the organization was fully prepared to discard him as a perfect sacrificial lamb to pacify public anger and protect their massive wealth. The actual downfall accelerated in 2020 when Danny Masterson was officially arrested and indicted on 3 counts of forcible rape against different victims. The moment he stood before the court, stripped of his expensive custom-tailored suits and lacking a squad of private investigators guarding his perimeter, he looked like nothing more than a broken, panicked, middle-aged man who was completely helpless. The arrogant confidence that once fueled his stance on his Hollywood balcony had entirely evaporated, replaced by the profound terror of someone realizing for the first time in his life that the national legal system was actually functioning and possessed absolutely no fear of his primetime television credentials. The legal warfare extending over the next 3 years was a series of intense, suffocating hearings where every single dirty tactic of the $1 million silence campaign was methodically dismantled by prosecutors. The entire world witnessed the exact mechanism of how the cult enforced its fair game policy to terrorize victims, how they mysteriously poisoned family pets, tapped phones, and psychologically manipulated young girls to protect Danny. Every single detail exposed was a fatal dagger plunged into his reputation and the organization behind him. A-list stars who once shared the dazzling spotlight with him immediately initiated personal PR campaigns to erase any past association, desperately try and preserve their own careers from his radioactive fallout. In September 2023, a Los Angeles Superior Court judge solemnly handed down the maximum penalty to Danny Masterson, 30 years to life in state prison. This was not a standard criminal sentence. It was a monumental declaration of justice, a fierce confirmation that $1 million protective shield, regardless of how fortified it is or how many shadow syndicates back it, must ultimately surrender to the power of truth and the resilient courage of victims. At 47 years old, the once untouchable sitcom star faced a brutal reality. He would spend the majority of his remaining biological existence behind the cold iron bars of a state penitentiary, completely isolated from the opulent world of fame he once treated as his personal birthright. Look deeply at the overarching irony of this spectacular self-destruction. Danny Masterson spent half of his life operating a ruthless system of institutional disconnection to isolate his victims, transforming them into voiceless ghosts within society. Yet, the final retribution he received was an absolute, permanent disconnection from the very elite world he worshipped. The moment the verdict was read, Netflix erased his name from future production credits. Cable networks pulled episodes featuring his face, and Scientology itself quickly issued an internal disconnection order against Danny Masterson to insulate themselves from further legal liabilities. He was discarded like a useless rag by the very monsters who had raised, enabled, and shielded his predatory behavior. The luxurious mansion nestled in the Hollywood Hills now stands completely empty, his expensive cocktails replaced by industrial prison trays, and the private investigators once hired to stalk others replaced by strict correctional officers monitoring his movements 24/7. Danny Masterson authored the final chapter of his own biography with a pen made of pure, delusional arrogance, foolishly believing that cash and spiritual protection could place him permanently above the law. He flew far too high, far too close to the sun of manufactured glory on wings woven from the trauma of his victims, only to crash into a devastating freefall, a flawless forensic autopsy on the absolute rot of elite privilege. To truly comprehend the spectacular, century-defining self-destruction of Danny Masterson, we cannot merely look at what transpired on the pages of legal indictments or the cold, calculated verdicts handed down by the court. We must place this entire entity onto forensic operating table of power psychology, methodically stripping away every layer of manufactured deception created by an ego bloated by elite privilege and systemic enablement. Danny Masterson did not simply wake up one day as an organized predator. He was a perfect byproduct, a monstrous anomaly sculpted by an environment where dirty, institutional cash was meticulously camouflaged by high-sounding spiritual doctrines, and where primetime television fame was treated as an absolute, lifetime passport of immunity. Let us dissect the psychological defense mechanisms utilized by Danny throughout the decades he executed his systematic campaign of abuse. Within the heavily warped mind of a master manipulator, the young women who crossed his path were never viewed as human beings possessing autonomy, deep emotions, or basic dignity. through a specific distorted lens. They were classified as nothing more than expendable assets, physical entertainment tools placed in his orbit solely to satisfy his pathological need to validate his supreme authority. This profound cruelty did not terminate with the physical violation itself. It manifested in a precise manner. He deployed the church's entire security and counterintelligence apparatus to systematically crush their psychological will to resist immediately afterward. He converted the systemic victimization of women into a high-stakes legal game of hide-and-seek, a game where he permanently dictated the rules by signing massive sponsorship checks. Imagine the sheer depth of delusional entitlement required to make a man genuinely believe he could exist entirely above national legislation, completely detached from the absolute baseline of human morality for over 20 consecutive years. This was a toxic combination of severe malignant narcissism and the absolute institutional protection of a multi-billion-dollar shadow empire. When Danny Masterson looked into the mirror, he did not see a sitcom actor whose career was gradually entering a state of natural expiration. He perceived himself as a sovereign entity, a chosen golden child entitled to a set of rules that regular mortals could never dream of accessing. This staggering arrogance was continuously fed by the hollow applause of exclusive Hollywood parties, by the cowardly, silent complicity of A-list co-stars who consciously chose to look away, and by the surveillance reports of private investigators confirming that his victims were living in a state of perpetual terror and isolation. He built a psychological fortress so heavily fortified that it rendered him completely blind to structural risks, ensuring an absolute inability to read the shifting cultural tectonics of the world. Yet, the satirical script of fate always possesses a brilliant way of locating the microscopic fractures in the shield. The exact root of Masterson's ultimate demise was located precisely within his greatest perceived strength, his absolute, unshakable overconfidence. Because he blindly believed that his victims would remain forever silenced under the combined weight of the fair game policy and the church's absolute disconnection orders, he grew lazy, neglecting to clean up his forensic footprints in the later stages of his career. He comfortably left behind a trail of incriminating digital messages, compromised witnesses, and psychological trauma, operating under the assumption that his shadow power was grand enough to rewrite reality itself. He utterly failed to realize that human trauma, when compressed to the absolute biological limit, does not evaporate. It stores itself like a massive kinetic spring, awaiting the exact socio-political catalyst to explode with a force capable of vaporizing empires. The moment Danny Masterson stepped through the iron gates of the state penitentiary to begin his 30-year sentence, an unprecedented cultural cleansing campaign was silently initiated across the landscape of Hollywood. This is a brutal but beautifully logical algorithm of the entertainment industry. The very second a glamorous icon transforms into a radioactive asset, the entire system immediately syndicates to erase every visible trace of their biological existence from the annals of pop culture history. The legendary sitcom That 70s Show, which served as a literal launching pad for Masterson's career and a cornerstone of nostalgia for an entire generation, suddenly became a heavily contaminated archive. Audiences could no longer comfortably laugh at the rebellious, cool guy punchlines of his character, Hyde, knowing that the actor behind the denim jacket was a convicted multi-count predator serving a life sentence. The retribution executed by society against Danny Masterson extended far beyond the physical deprivation of his liberty. It was an absolute, systemic erasure of his cultural identity. Netflix, executing a swift, cold, and calculated public relations maneuver, did not merely fire him from his final major project, The Ranch. They aggressively moved to blur his digital footprint across all historical promotional materials. Syndication networks began systematically revoking broadcasting rights, and cable channels wiped episodes featuring his likeness from their programming schedules. Within a matter of months, a man who once dictated the social hierarchy of Los Angeles was reduced to a radioactive taboo, a banned noun that no executive or publicist dare to utter in a corporate boardroom. The entire empire, cultural capital he spent his existence constructing, trading away his honor and his humanity to acquire, dissolved into thin air like a cruel, multi-million-dollar joke. Look closely at the absolute, freezing isolation of his current prison existence to witness the ultimate irony of elite loyalty. The close Hollywood confidants who once shared the blinding glare of the red carpet, the high-profile celebrities who signed hypocritical character letters begging the judge for leniency prior to sentencing, have completely vanished into the shadows. They are now deeply occupied with their new corporate PR campaigns, loudly advocating for women's empowerment and systemic equity to preserve their own lucrative contract renewals at the Academy Awards. Not a single soul visits a cell. Not a single letter of encouragement crosses a correctional desk. And absolutely no one wants to be captured by a paparazzi lens anywhere near a location associated with his name. He has been permanently disconnected from the elite ecosystem, converted into an anonymous inmate number, completely helpless, discarded, and forgotten. This is a genuine, lasting legacy that Danny Masterson leaves behind for the world. Not a collection of award-winning television episodes, not a list of religious buildings funded by laundered contributions, but chilling textbook case study on the absolute anatomy of systemic privilege and rot. His downfall stands as an unyielding warning to every powerful entity currently operating within the hills of Hollywood. Anyone foolishly operating under the delusion that wealth and shadow syndicates can allow them to maintain a secret kingdom of abuse beyond the reach of the law. The grand multi-million-dollar wall of silence constructed by Scientology, regardless of its financial fortification or psychological intimidation tactics, was ultimately forced crumble when confronted by the resilient, unyielding courage of women who refuse to allow their lives to be written off as collateral damage. As we permanently seal the psychological forensic file of Danny Masterson, the overarching narrative reveals itself to be a deeply dark, satirical masterpiece of cosmic justice. It is a story with a predator, intoxicated by the very fumes of his own grandiosity, systematically engineered his own execution. Masterson spent the better part of his adult life establishing corrupt networks of power, bribing institutions, and operating calculated campaigns of psychological terror to insulate his ego from external consequences. He genuinely believed he had crafted a flawless, bulletproof shield. What his narcissism prevented him from seeing was that this very shield acted as a sensory deprivation chamber, completely isolating him from external reality, preventing him from predicting his own downfall and ensuring that his eventual freefall will be infinitely more devastating when the shield inevitably shattered. The elite game of privilege operates on an incredibly ruthless, highly transactional mathematics. The apparatus will protect you only as long as the financial and reputational cost of hiding your crimes does not exceed the economic value you generate for the firm. The exact moment Danny Masterson's legal liabilities began threatening the core machinery, he was immediately reevaluated as nothing more than a toxic liability on a corporate balance sheet. His church, his production studios, and his inner circle of celebrity friends did not hesitate for a single second to liquidate him in the coldest, most efficient manner imaginable. He was violently ground to dust by the very gears of the corporate machine he once bragged about controlling, thrown into the dumpster of entertainment history as a warning label regarding the absolute expiration date of corrupt power. The 30-year sentence handed down to Danny Masterson represents far more than the structural termination of an individual Hollywood actor's career. It marks the definitive collapse of a grand illusion, the toxic myth that a human being can possess enough old money and institutional backing to permanently hold a monopoly over the truth. The opulent lights of the Hollywood hills continue to glitter beneath the bright California sun. The lavish parties continue to flow with expensive champagne, and million-dollar corporate contracts are still signed with clinical precision every day. But deep within the foundations of that elite kingdom, a permanent, irreversible fracture has been carved. The ghost of Danny Masterson will forever haunt those hills, standing as a cold, forensic manifesto on the absolute gravity of self-destruction, a timeless proof that when human evil is nurtured by supreme arrogance, it will always generate the exact energy required to trigger its own magnificent annihilation.